Hello and welcome to this module. This module is going to deal with basically the impact of the past and how that affects us. And I'll give you a brief overview about how the mind manages the processes that come up from the past. So I'd like to begin with one of the thought leaders in psychology, Sigmund Freud. And he said that we are what we are because we have been what we have been. And what is needed for solving the problems of human life and motives is not moral estimates, but more knowledge. And I think this is really important because what he's saying here, in a lot of ways, is that you really need to have an understanding about where we've been to know why we are who we are. And there are some modalities in psychology that care less about the past, but I think when it comes in totality to thinking about what makes us such complex human beings, it is really important to look at the past, to understand the elements of our past that have shaped us in many ways, and that a lot of our decisions going forward relate on the past. So I'd like to share with you a wonderful quote by an American psychologist. And he offers, "The past saturates the present. It's in the fabric of your reactions to the world around you. It's reflected in how you treat the closest people in your life. It imbues your dreams with symbolic meaning and each of your desires with their particular itch. The past fills your daydreams, resentments, longings, and sorrows. It determines what you think you can and can't achieve and underpins your most fundamental conception of yourself." The most fundamental conception of yourself, it determines that, which is really interesting. And that was Bell Herring. And why that's important is because the mind is really a reservoir of memories, a reservoir of elements that describe to ourselves who we are and what we're capable of, said so beautifully in this passage. So in many ways, the unconscious mind is a reservoir of feelings, thoughts, urges, and memories that are outside of our conscious awareness. What that means is that in essence, a lot of our behavior in psychology is directed by our unconscious. That means that even though I have an idea when I walk into a shop and I write a list down of 2 things to buy, let's say it's just bread and milk, I go into the shop with that conscious list created conscientiously, and I walk in, and then for some reason I leave the shop with 2 baskets full of goodies. In that moment, the unconscious is at work, and a lot of its work is done without us knowing it at the time consciously. Jung had an expression about the unconscious. He offered that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will control your life, and you will call it fate. This is really important. It reminds me of the example about going into the shop. I went in with a list of 2 elements and I seem to have come out with a whole lot. Or if I go shopping for clothes and I go in and I think, I'm going to go in and buy like a plain t-shirt or some jeans. And then I come out with all sorts of strange clothing that I didn't intend to buy when I first walked in. This is the unconscious in full flight. Without getting into too much detail around the biological aspect of the unconscious, there is a part of our brain that is more connected to the senses, and that is the corticolimbic system. And this picks up all the senses first, and is also the origin point of a lot of our emotions and feelings. And this system has to talk to the prefrontal cortex, which is the front of our brains. In mammalian brains, and certainly in humans, we have a very big prefrontal cortex. And this prefrontal cortex is, in a lot of ways, is the area of our brain that does the cognitive conscientious function. So when we look at the brain, and this is very reductionistic, so it's not at all a proper biological illustration, but know that a large part of our brain is operating without us knowing. Breathing is a very good example. You go throughout the day and you breathe on your own. You breathe unconsciously. And then suddenly I want to dive into a pool and I need to know to hold my breath, at which point I employ the conscious part of my thinking and I take control of my breath. I hold my breath underwater. and then I come up and out of the water, and then I can let go of that conscious control of my breath, and as I exit the water, my unconscious takes over the breathing again. This is really important when we consider not only addiction, but a lot of mental issues, mental health issues, because we need to have traversed through our unconscious in some kind of counseling or some kind of reflection to know what it is that makes up that vast library of our unconscious. I think about the unconscious as all the things that happen to us over time. In Dean Bonomano's book, Your Brain is a Time Machine, he has an excerpt which says, the brain remembers the past to predict the future. In psychoanalytic theory, we look at human behavior, and psychoanalytic theory is one of the modalities for psychology. It's one of the ways that psychology is used and implemented, it's studied. We look at this expression, and I'd like to read it from bottom to top, if I may. At the bottom there, we have love, loss, sexuality, and death. And these are all the experiences we have, as you can see above, with childhood encounters. So as a child, we encounter these four facets: love, loss, sexuality, and death. And that may be either to us personally as an experience, or in fact, it may be what we've seen other people process in this way. So how did I see other people deal with love, with loss, sexuality, and death? More so, of course, how I experienced love, loss, sexuality, and death. What is love? Well, love is nurturing, it's care, it's affinity. What is loss? Loss could be losing a teddy at the age of 4, to losing a pet, to walking into a shop and expecting a certain kind of toy or sweet to be there and realizing when one arrives there that it isn't there. That is also loss. And loss is also the loss of affinity, the loss of friendship, in some ways rejection and abandonment. Sexuality is so important. Often we don't like to talk about sexuality, but it is critical to who we are. It is literally the reason why we continue to live on this planet. And I think that when one talks about sexuality, childhood is filled with sexuality because it's where it hasn't really begun to where it flourishes. That whole period across from first discovering who we are, identity, our sexual drives, and then pairing up, and then eventually, as we get into adolescence and adulthood, having sex with other people. So sexuality, what we see about it, so all of these childhood encounters we have with these four facets become this library, this beautiful big library of all of our memories that become unconscious. And because the brain is a time machine, whenever we want to predict what to do next, we will travel to that library and see what happened before. If I'm walking into a room full of people, my brain in some ways is going to go into that unconscious library and check out what the thing to do is, what kind of emotions sit around this, what was the behavior before that I used to get through this. And that's why we say human behavior is determined in many ways by that. So human behavior is determined by unconscious motivations that are the products of childhood encounters with love, loss, sexuality, and death. I'd like just to explore for a second in quite a simplistic way how the unconscious and conscious blend together and what makes up the different elements. So everything in this illustration, which is obviously an iceberg, everything below that waterline there is unconscious, and at that waterline you see pre-conscious, and then above you have conscious. And in psychology we know that there are two tasks in the brain, two sets of tasks that the brain processes, or modes the brain processes in. And the one is selective, which is the conscious, which is when I am actually appear to do the thing that I want to do. I make a list, I pick a thing. And then of course there are the automatic tasks, like breathing, for example. Or if you get pricked by a pin, you don't choose first whether you want to feel that feeling or not. The body simply registers it automatically. So there we have the difference between the two styles, which is very important. And just very briefly to get into this, what we see is that the id is the beginning of our library. It's our drives, all the things that drives us. Now when we're a child and when we're born, we have very simple drives. To be clothed, to be fed, or to be kept warm, to be fed, eventually to also go to the toilet, to relieve ourselves. And then eventually our needs become more sophisticated, the need for affinity, the need for different things. But basically the need for survival and the need to eat and procreate, these are our basic drives, and they're built into us when we're born. They become more sophisticated over time. Then at some point the unconscious develops a set of books in the library that grow at an exponential rate. And this is the superego. These are the messages that we get as we grow up from the outside world. As we do something, the world will respond to us. So for example, if we're doing potty training as an example, and my parents maybe were finicky about the potty training, they may have panicked a bit or maybe reacted quite poorly. And at that point, I start hearing the words around the ages of 2. I hear the words no and don't and stop it and not like that and you can't do that, that's not for you. And these messages become very real messages that get fed into the superego, which eventually become law. I internalize them as true and they do not get challenged. And that is problematic because they go unchallenged for a very long time, and because they become law, we internalize them as our own voice, not as a voice that we got earlier in life from someone else. And you can see these two factions in the unconscious, the id, the drives, the needs, and on the other side, the superego, which is all about kind of punitive, idealistic messages towards us. And then, much maligned in pop psychology, is the ego. The ego is actually the balancing force. It really is the part of us that reality tests. It's the part of us that is conscious. It's a part of us that can make decisions. It's the part of us that focuses, that looks at reality and tries to understand. But there's something interesting that happens in the mind. Is the id has drives, as I said, as a child that begins quite plainly, the need to survive, the need to eat, the need to procreate or eventually procreate. So the id has a message in the unconscious. It has a drive, which is I need something. But then the superego might say, no, you don't deserve this, especially if it's punitive messages from childhood. It might say, well, let's look at an example. So, maybe I want to eat a piece of cake. And I'm hungry, and my id says, yeah, let's have some cake. And then the superego, which can be very subtle over time and have very, very complex messages, very harmful messages, the superego won't just say, cake is not good for you. It might not even just say, cake is unhealthy or cake makes you fat. The superego becomes very, very subtle. It can start saying things to us like, no one likes fat people. No one likes overweight people. You're going to be alone eventually if you eat that cake because no one's going to like your body. The superego can become very subtle over time if it gets over-processed and overdeveloped. And when these two collide, when these two superpowers in our unconscious collide, Freud referred to this as the source of all anxiety. So the anxiety pushes up into our consciousness. So this whole argy-bargy goes on. This whole fight goes on without us really knowing. And when that happens, all we really feel is anxiety. So if we play this out in an example, I'm walking towards a table where there's cake. I just had one piece of cake, and then I'm walking towards the table, and I'm like, oh, I really feel I want to. You just feel that feeling that you want another second piece of cake, the id at work. The superego will then tell you messages about what that cake means to you and what it means to you as a human being and who you are if you eat it. And the anxiety pushes up. So as I'm walking towards the table and I see the cake, I'm about to go and grab it, and then I'm feeling kind of anxious. At which point, that's the time when I actually can feel the messages coming up, but I can't tell what the actual messages are. So the ego, or our awareness, our consciousness, has to do something with that. And we see this time and time again. It really is a battle. Another example would be the id will say, I need to express anger. I need to express anger. I feel anger. I need to vent the anger. And then, let's say, for example, it was a significant other. Then the superego would say, don't bother, you'll be rejected. You don't have a voice in this relationship. You're not allowed to. It's not your place. You'll be rejected, you'll be abandoned. Of course, the ego has a real problem here. What it really should be doing at that point is then saying, well, let's choose a middle ground here. I can express my emotional state in a meaningful and validated way. That would be a normal, healthy ego response from these two disparate messages that come up. The one that says, I'm angry about this and I have to talk about it, versus the other voice that says, ooh, don't say anything in case you get abandoned. The anxiety comes up, and if I know what's going on for me and I've done some work in counseling and in therapy, I will know that that message means that I need to take action. And taking action in a normative way, without defenses, without feeling defended, would be to express and validate my anger in a meaningful way. But what happens in a lot of the cases, specifically if there's been trauma as a child, is that it doesn't happen in a meaningful way, it happens in a maladapted way. And then the ego gets to use these defenses. So instead of trying to deal with the conversation between, or the argy-bargy, the war between these two factions and then unconscious, instead what it does is it tries to defend against those feelings that come up, that anxiety that comes up, those awkward feelings, those restless feelings. And Anna Freud, Sigmund Freud's daughter, she developed this list based on his work and her own work. And the list is a lot of things that you might recognize on the screen. For example, we have humor, focusing on funny aspects of a painful situation instead of feeling the pain. So something traumatic or painful happens, and the id says, "Oh, that doesn't feel good. I feel uneasy, and I want to cry. I want to be unhappy." But the superego might say, "Well, no one's going to like you if you cry." So instead, what I do, I defend with humor. I use humor in the situation instead. There's another very popular one called reaction formation, which is when we almost reverse the feeling around to try and defend against it. It's a bit like suppressing, but in fact, flipping it completely 180. So for example, at a funeral, if I'm at a funeral at a friend who was very close to me and I feel a huge amount of sadness and grief, the id energy, the need energy is to grieve, is to cry, is to go, this is the saddest day of my life, and to have tears and catharsis with pouring of tears. But the superego, if I'm a man historically, or anyone I suppose, but if I'm at this funeral and I've been taught that boys don't cry, well, I'll just stand there and the superego is going on at me saying, well, boys don't cry, you're not allowed to show your emotion here, who do you think you are, you've got to hold it together. Be a man, all these really punitive, kind of cul-de-sac, kind of punitive messages from the superego. So these feelings come up, on the one hand grief, on the other side punitive thoughts, and then it creates an anxiety, and that pushes up through into my consciousness. So I'm standing at the funeral, and instead of doing either of those things, I use reaction formation, which is to say, this guy was such a great guy, we're not going to be sad today, we're going to party, we're going to party hard, the guy was a legend, let's do it. No tears today, And that for me is one of the greatest heartbreaks in the defenses, because often we'll need to express ourselves and we simply don't get the chance. And all that energy doesn't come out through catharsis, and I didn't get a chance to grieve at that funeral. Instead, I had to hold all of that emotion down. And the second effect is that I've been inauthentic. I haven't been able to express my true identity. So we see a lot of defenses. And the one that concerns addiction in particular is displacement. And I invite you to watch the addiction module, how it works as well, because they'll get much more into how that displacement works. But it's to say that when we channel a feeling to another target, or we offset the feeling to another target. So another example would be, and the common one, is if the boss has been ragging on me all day, I can't tell the boss how I feel because my superego says, no, you can't, because you're going to get fired and you need to have this job and no one else is going to employ you, so you better suck it up. And then I go home and I take my anger out on maybe someone at home. So this is very much how the consciousness and the unconscious work. The unconscious world is so rich and so beautiful, and even if childhoods were traumatic, I invite you to think about your unconscious, this library of who you are, these books in this beautiful library. Some are quite dark, some are quite beautiful, some are quite neutral, but it's your sacred library. And know that within that library is a way how we look back in time when we're going to predict the future. And know that sometimes we will defend against some of these feelings based on the past. This excerpt here is from Lance Doty's book on addiction, The Heart of Addiction. And he says that, when actions are taken directly to deal with helplessness, there is no addiction. So I invite you to watch the addiction module as well. And I think that this will round out some of that knowledge. So when you do hit into the how it works in addiction, you'll get quite a lot more to think about.